So before we actually start implementing our components that are functional components that make use of React hooks, let's talk about a brief history of React and how React hooks came to be. Now, back in May 2013, when React was first launched or released, then there was no such thing as a class in JavaScript. And in order for React to provide the functionality so that each component could have some state and it could receive props, then React implemented a method to create a class, which is not a JavaScript class. And this would basically be an object that had certain methods inside it, such as getting the initial state and returning what we define as the initial state. And it also had access to React lifecycle methods, such as component_did_mount. And just like components of today, when the component receives new props or the state is updated, then this would cause a re-render, and via the virtual DOM it would update the actual DOM. So if we move forward to January 2015 with the release of ES6, which implemented class declarations inside JavaScript, React made the move to make use of JavaScript classes rather than defining their own classes. React were not in the class making business, so they decided it was beneficial to make use of JavaScript classes instead. And we would create a React class by extending from React.component class. Now there's a couple of things to point out here, that in order to extend a class we have to invoke super before we can actually use the class, and we also have to remember to pass in the props as well into this call to super. And then we can define the state of our component by saying list.state and providing a state object. But in order to use the methods inside this class, we would have to bind them to our constructor. And there was often some confusion with using this inside a JavaScript class, as it works slightly different to how it works in other languages. And binding our functions to classes would sometimes lead to questions such as this, and a developer wondering why they were getting a unquote type error, cannot read property set state of undefined. And that's because the function in this case was not correctly bound into the constructor. And the way it should have been written is list.delta equals list.delta bind and then lis. So it was a point of confusion. And shortly afterwards, we move on to the class fields proposal. And this allows us to declare our state as a class property without needing to specify it inside the constructor. Now, without a constructor, we need another way to bind our functions to our class. But along came arrow functions at the same time, and these auto-bind to our class, and we don't need to specifically bind them inside a constructor. And this removed some of the confusion because we're not using this in so many places in our class. But this still exists, and this is one of the concerns that React have, is the barrier to entry to learning React. They want to try and remove that and make React much easier to learn. And that's where React hooks comes in. And if we look at the motivation for React and why they've introduced this, one of the reasons is that it's always been hard to reuse stateful logic between components. React doesn't offer a way to attach reusable behavior to a component, and if you've worked with React before, you'll probably be familiar with patterns like render props and higher order components that try and solve this particular problem. But these patterns require us to restructure our components when we use them, and this can make our code harder to follow. And with hooks, we can extract stateful logic from a component so it can be tested independently and reused. And hooks allow us to reuse stateful logic without changing our component hierarchy. And it makes it easy to share hooks among many components or with the community. Also, another reason was that complex components become hard to understand. And it's often the case that you can start out with a simple component that grows into an unmanageable mess of stateful logic and side effects. Each React class component might perform some kind of data fetching in component_did_mount and component_did_update, and then would have any cleanup in a component_will_unmount method. And this can make it easy to introduce bugs and inconsistencies in our code. And the third major reason for React hooks is that React found that classes confuse both people and machines. And the makers of React have found that classes can be a large barrier to learning React. And classes need to be understood in JavaScript, which is very different to how it works in most languages. So the goal really is just to remove classes from React and make all of the functionality that you get with a React component class available in a normal functional component. And hooks let us use React features without classes. So just to finish off, let's take a very quick look at a component that's using React hooks instead of using a class component. And we can see in this particular case, we're setting local state inside the functional component that's not a class component, but we can use local state inside here. And in this case, we're using the useState hook. And the useState hook takes an array, or in order to use the useState hook, we provide an array. And the first part of the array is the piece of state, in this case an activity or a loading indicator. And the second element in the array is the function that we can use to change what's inside this state. And when we use the useState hook in the argument, we can also give it an initial value. In the case of the activity, it's an empty object, and in the case of the loading flag, it's set to true. And lower down, we can see that we can use this useState hook to set the activity and then set the loading indicator, which causes an update to our state and it re-renders the component. And we also have in here the useEffect hook, and this is used for side effects in our component. So a side effect in this component is we want to load an activity, and we pass this load activity an ID. And this is kind of equivalent to the component didMount one we looked at earlier. So this is just a very short example of React hooks, and we will be using lots of them in our application. And what we're going to do next is start to actually build our application.